I grew up in a small town tucked deep in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where the hollers run so narrow that sunlight only hits the ground for a few hours each day. My family had lived there for generations, and everyone knew the rules about the woods. Don't go out after dark. Don't answer if you hear your name called from the trees. And never, ever follow a whistle. The town itself was barely a town at all, just a collection of houses scattered along a winding two-lane road that snaked through the valley. Most families had been there for generations, their ancestors buried in small cemeteries on hillsides overlooking their homes. The mountains surrounded us on all sides, dense with oak and pine, riddled with old mining tunnels and forgotten logging roads that led nowhere. My grandmother lived with us, and she was the keeper of all the old stories. She would sit on the porch in her rocking chair, snapping green beans or shelling peas, and tell me about the things that lived in the mountains. She never called them monsters or ghosts. She just called them things, like that was all the description they needed. She said they had always been there, long before our people came to these hills, and they would be there long after we were gone. I was 16 the summer it happened, and I thought I was too old to believe in mountain superstitions. My friends and I would hike the trails during the day, exploring old mining roads and forgotten cabins. We would find rusted tools and broken furniture, evidence of lives lived and abandoned. But we always made it back before sunset. Always. My girlfriend at the time was a girl named Emma, and her family lived about 2 miles down the road from us. The path between our houses followed the main road for most of the way, but there was a stretch where the road curved wide around a hill, and a footpath cut straight through the woods, saving about 15 minutes of walking. During the day, I used that shortcut all the time. At night, I always took the long way. One evening in late July, I was at Emma's house, and we lost track of time. We were sitting on her porch, talking and watching the fireflies come out, and I didn't notice how dark it was getting until her father came outside and mentioned that I should probably head home. I looked at the sky and felt my stomach drop. The sun had already gone down, and the sky had turned that deep bruised purple that comes right before full dark. I said goodbye and started walking, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. The road was well traveled, and there were houses every half mile or so. I would be fine. I just needed to walk fast and keep my head down. I started walking faster, my sneakers crunching on the gravel road. The cicadas were screaming in the trees, and the air felt thick and heavy, the way it does in the mountains during summer. I remember thinking about my grandmother's warnings, how she would tell me that things came out in the mountains when the light faded, things that looked almost human but weren't, things that could mimic voices and sounds, luring people off the path. I had been walking for maybe 10 minutes when I passed the point where the footpath split off into the woods. I didn't even look at it. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, focused on putting one foot in front of the other. That was when I heard the whistle. It was high and clear, almost musical, coming from somewhere deep in the trees to my left. At first I thought it might be a bird, but it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. 3 short bursts, then silence, then 3 more. I stopped walking and listened. My heart was starting to pound, but I told myself I was being stupid. It was probably just someone out hiking, maybe lost and trying to signal for help. But something about it felt wrong. The whistle was too perfect, too measured, and it was coming from deep in the forest, far from any trail. Then I heard it again, closer this time, and it sounded like it was moving parallel to the road, keeping pace with me. I started walking again, faster now, trying not to look toward the trees. The whistle came again, and this time it was definitely closer. I could hear branches snapping in the underbrush, something moving through the forest alongside me. The sound was steady and purposeful, not the random noise of an animal moving through the woods. My grandmother's voice echoed in my head, telling me never to acknowledge it, never to respond. She said that if you answered, if you showed any sign that you heard it, it would know you were afraid. And that was when it would come for you. The road curved ahead, and I knew if I could just make it around the bend, I would be able to see the lights from the Johnson house. They always left their porch light on, and it was the brightest point on this stretch of road. I focused on that thought, using it to push down the panic rising in my chest. I broke into a jog, my breath coming hard, and the whistle erupted again, right at the edge of the tree line. so close I could almost feel it, like someone was standing just behind the first row of trees, watching me. I ran. Behind me, I heard something crash through the brush and onto the road. Footsteps, heavy and uneven, started following me. Not running, just walking with long, loping strides that covered ground impossibly fast. The sound was wrong, the rhythm off, like something that had learned to walk by watching humans but couldn't quite get it right. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to keep my eyes forward, to focus on the curve ahead. My lungs were burning, and I could feel my legs starting to shake, but I pushed myself harder. The footsteps stayed right behind me, close enough that I thought I could hear breathing, low and raspy, with a wet quality that made my skin crawl. Then the whistle came one more time, so loud and so close that it felt like it was right next to my ear. I screamed and sprinted around the curve. The porch light of the Johnson house blazed ahead like a beacon, cutting through the darkness, and I ran straight toward it, stumbling up the steps and pounding on the door with both fists. "Mrs. Johnson opened it almost immediately, looking startled, and I practically fell inside. She caught me by the shoulders and asked me what was wrong, her voice sharp with concern. I tried to explain, gasping for breath, pointing back toward the road. She looked past me, out toward the road, and her face went pale. She said something was standing at the edge of her yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. She said it looked like a man, tall and thin, but it was standing completely still and facing the house. The way she described it, the posture was wrong, the proportions slightly off, like a crude approximation of a human form. We stood there in the doorway and watched it for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. It didn't move at all, didn't sway or shift weight the way a living person would. It just stood there, a dark shape against the deeper darkness of the trees. Then it turned, the movement sudden and jerky, and walked back into the forest. It made no sound at all, no footsteps on the gravel, no branches breaking. It just disappeared into the shadows like it had never been there. Mrs. Johnson locked the door and called my parents to come pick me up. While we waited, she made me sit down and drink a glass of water. She didn't say much after that, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew what I had heard. She had probably heard it herself at some point, or knew someone who had. When my parents arrived, my father didn't ask many questions. He just looked at Mrs. Johnson, and she nodded, and that seemed to be enough. On the drive home, he told me that I was lucky I ran toward a light. He said that was the only thing that worked, getting to a source of light and staying there until it lost interest. I never walked that road alone, again after dark, and sometimes, on quiet summer nights when the air is thick and heavy, I still hear that whistle in my dreams. 3 short bursts, clear and deliberate, calling from somewhere just out of sight, and I wake up in a cold sweat, checking the windows, making sure all the lights are on. My uncle owned a farm on the Virginia side of the mountains, right up against the West Virginia border. The property had been in our family since before the Civil War, and the farmhouse was old, the kind of place with slanted floors and doors that never quite closed right. The foundation was made of stacked stone, and the walls were thick timber, hand-hewn by my ancestors. Behind the house was a root cellar, dug into the hillside, with heavy wooden doors that opened into the earth. I spent a few weeks there every summer helping with chores, and I loved it. The work was hard, but the mountains were beautiful, and my uncle was a quiet, steady man who taught me how to fix fences and tend crops. He had a way of moving through the world that felt deliberate and purposeful, like he understood something about the land that I didn't. But he had one rule that he repeated every time I visited: stay out of the root cellar after dark. He never explained why, and I never asked. I figured it was just an old man being cautious, worried I might trip on the stone steps or get locked in. The cellar was old and poorly lit, with only a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, and the steps were worn smooth from generations of use. But looking back now, I realize he was afraid of something. The cellar itself was typical of old mountain farms. It was cool and damp year-round, perfect for storing vegetables and preserves. The walls were carved directly out of the earth, supported by rough timber beams, and the floor was packed dirt. Shelves lined the walls, built from salvaged lumber, and they were packed with mason jars filled with canned tomatoes, pickles, and green beans. The air always smelled like earth and old wood, with a faint undertone of something else, something sour and organic that I could never quite place. It was mid-August, and the heat that summer was brutal, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer over the fields and turned the sky a washed-out white. My uncle asked me to grab some canning jars from the cellar in the late afternoon, and I headed down without thinking twice. I opened the heavy wooden doors, letting them fall back against the hillside with a thud, and descended the stone steps. The temperature dropped immediately, and I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. The single bulb cast harsh shadows across the shelves, making the jars gleam like eyes. I grabbed what I needed, a box of empty jars for my aunt's canning project, and climbed back out into the sunlight. The doors felt heavier than usual when I closed them, and I had to put my shoulder into it to get them latched properly. But that night, I woke up around 2 in the morning. The house was silent except for the sound of crickets outside, and I was thirsty. I got up and walked to the kitchen for a glass of water, my bare feet silent on the worn wooden floors. As I stood at the sink, letting the tap run cold, I heard something. It was coming from outside, near the cellar. A scraping sound, slow and rhythmic, like something heavy being dragged across stone. I froze, listening, and the sound stopped. Then it started again, louder this time. I looked out the kitchen window, and I could just barely see the cellar doors in the moonlight. They were open, not all the way, just a crack, maybe 6 inches, and something dark was moving inside. My first thought was that an animal had gotten in, maybe a raccoon or a possum looking for food. We had problems with raccoons sometimes, clever enough to work latches and get into things. But the way it moved was wrong. It was too deliberate, too slow. I watched as the doors opened a little wider, the hinges making no sound at all, and a shape emerged. It was low to the ground, crawling on all fours, but it was too large to be any animal I knew. The proportions were wrong, the limbs too long, the movement too fluid. It moved like water flowing uphill, unnatural and hypnotic. I stood there, frozen, as it moved across the yard. It stopped near the edge of the garden and raised its head, and I swear it looked directly at the window where I was standing. I couldn't make out details, just the shape of it, hunched and wrong, with a head that seemed too large for its body. The moonlight caught something, maybe eyes or just reflective surfaces, and I saw 2 points of light glinting in the darkness. They stayed fixed on the window for what felt like an eternity, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't look away. Then it turned and crawled back toward the cellar, its movements slow and purposeful, disappearing inside. The doors closed with a soft thud, and I heard the latch click into place. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. When I finally went back to bed, I didn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound outside. The house settled and creaked, and every noise made my heart race. The next morning, I told my uncle what I had seen. He didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at his coffee, his weathered hands wrapped around the mug. Then he told me that his father had seen the same thing when he was a boy. He said that something lived in the cellar, something that had been there long before the house was built. He didn't know what it was, and he didn't want to know. He just knew that it stayed down there as long as you didn't bother it after dark. He told me that years ago, a hired hand had gone down to the cellar late one night, looking for a tool he had left behind. They found him the next morning, sitting at the bottom of the steps, staring at the wall. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't move. He just sat there, shaking, his eyes wide and unfocused. They had to carry him out, and he left the farm that same day. My uncle said the man never spoke about what he saw, but he never worked on a farm again. He moved to the city and took a job in a factory, somewhere with electric lights and concrete floors, as far from the earth as he could get. My uncle said that the thing in the cellar didn't hurt people, not exactly, but it didn't like being disturbed. And if you went down there after dark, it would show you something. Something that would stay with you, something that would change the way you saw the world. He told me that his grandfather, the man who built the house, had known about it. The cellar was already there when he bought the land, dug by someone long forgotten, and he built the house around it because the earth was already disturbed. His grandfather said that some places were older than people, and that you had to respect what was already there. I finished out the summer, but I never went near the cellar again. And every night, I would lie in bed and listen, waiting for the sound of those doors opening. Most nights, I didn't hear anything. But sometimes, usually in the dead hours between midnight and dawn, I would hear that scraping sound, slow and patient, moving in the dark beneath the house. On those nights, I would pull the blankets up to my chin and stare at the ceiling, counting the seconds until sunrise. And I would think about that shape in the moonlight, the way it had looked at me with those glinting points of light, and I would wonder what it was waiting for. I never went back to the farm after that summer. My uncle sold the property a few years later and moved to town. He never told me why, but I think I know. Some things are better left alone, buried deep where the light doesn't reach. And some places remember you, long after you've forgotten them. There is a place in the mountains of North Carolina called Cove Creek, a remote stretch of forest where the trees grow so thick that even in daylight it feels like dusk. The canopy is so dense that very little sunlight reaches the forest floor, and the undergrowth is a tangle of laurel and rhododendron that can swallow a trail in a single season. My father used to hunt there when he was younger, and he always told me that the woods felt different there, like they were watching you. He said it was the kind of place where sounds didn't travel right, where you could call out to someone 20 feet away and they wouldn't hear you, but you could hear whispers from 100 yards off. He said the old-timers avoided it, claimed it was bad ground, though no one could quite say why. When I was 19, a group of friends and I decided to spend a weekend camping in the area. We had heard about an old abandoned cabin near the creek, and we thought it would be a good place to explore. My father warned me not to go, told me that people who stayed in that cabin had a habit of leaving in a hurry, their belongings left behind like they couldn't get out fast enough. But I didn't listen. I was young and stupid, and I thought he was just being overprotective. There were 5 of us: me, my girlfriend Sarah, my best friend Aaron, and 2 others, Jake and Melissa. We loaded up our packs with camping gear and food, and we drove out to the trailhead on a Friday afternoon in early October. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the mountains were beautiful, painted in shades of orange and gold. We hiked in on a Friday afternoon, following an overgrown trail that wound through the forest. The path was barely visible in places, choked with undergrowth, and we had to push through curtains of spiderwebs strung between the trees. The air was cool and damp, smelling of rotting leaves and moss. The cabin was exactly where the map said it would be, sitting in a small clearing near the Prife water. It was old, maybe 100 years or more, with a sagging roof and broken windows. The logs were grey with age, and the gaps between them had been chinked with mud that had long since crumbled away. But it was still standing, and we figured it would be better than sleeping in tents. We set up inside, clearing out debris and sweeping the floor with a makeshift broom made from branches. The interior was a single room with a stone hearth at one end and a loft space above, accessible by a rickety ladder. There was an old table in the center, scarred and stained, and a few pieces of broken furniture pushed against the walls. We built a fire in the stone hearth, and it took a while to get it going because the chimney was partially blocked. Once it caught, though, it roared to life, filling the cabin with warmth and light. The sun was setting, and the light coming through the trees turned everything orange and gold. It felt peaceful, almost magical. We cooked dinner over the fire, boiling water for freeze-dried meals, and told stories about other camping trips and close calls with wildlife. For a while, everything was perfect. But then the sun went down, and the temperature dropped fast. The mountains have a way of doing that, going from comfortable to bone cold in less than an hour. The fire was roaring, but the cold seemed to seep through the walls, settling into our bones. The wind picked up outside, making the trees creak and groan, and the cabin felt smaller somehow, more claustrophobic. One of my friends, Aaron, said he kept feeling like someone was standing behind him. He would turn around, but no one was there. Sarah laughed it off at first, saying he was just psyching himself out, but I could tell she was starting to feel uneasy too. There was something about the cabin that felt wrong, like we were intruding on something that didn't want us there. Around midnight, we heard the first knock. It came from the back wall of the cabin. 3 slow, deliberate thuds that echoed through the room. We all stopped talking and listened. The fire crackled and the wind howled outside, but there was nothing else. Then it came again. Same rhythm, same intensity. Aaron got up and shined his flashlight at the wall, but there was nothing there, just old wood and shadows. He said maybe it was a branch hitting the cabin, but the sound was too regular, too deliberate. Branches didn't knock in perfect groups of 3. We tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just the cabin settling, or maybe an animal outside. But then the knocking started moving. It traveled along the wall, from the back to the side, then to the front door. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, over and over, methodical and patient. One of the girls, Sarah, said we should leave. She was pale, her hands shaking, and I could see real fear in her eyes. She said that whatever was outside wasn't friendly, and we should get out while we still could. But the rest of us were still trying to rationalize it, saying it had to be someone messing with us. Maybe some locals who didn't want outsiders in the area. Aaron said he was going to go outside and check. He grabbed his flashlight and a hiking stick, saying he would look around the perimeter and see if anyone was out there. We told him not to, but he was stubborn, convinced he could find a logical explanation. He opened the door, and the knocking stopped immediately. The silence was sudden and oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. He stepped out onto the porch, and we all crowded near the doorway, watching him. The woods were completely silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just dead, empty silence. Aaron walked to the edge of the clearing, shining his light into the trees. He called out, asking if anyone was there, his voice sounding small and swallowed by the darkness. No response. He stood there for a moment, his flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the tree line. And then he turned to, "Come back inside." That was when we saw it. There was something standing just behind him, at the edge of the tree line, tall and thin, almost blending into the shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, watching. The proportions were wrong, the arms too long, hanging almost to the ground, and the head was tilted at an unnatural angle. We all started yelling at Aaron to come back, and he must have heard the panic in our voices because he ran. He sprinted back to the cabin, and we slammed the door shut behind him, throwing the bolt and pushing the old table against it. Aaron was breathing hard, his eyes wide, and he asked us what we saw. When we told him, he went pale. He said he felt something behind him, a presence, cold and patient, but he didn't turn around because he knew instinctively that he shouldn't. The knocking started again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. It came from all sides of the cabin, surrounding us. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. It went on for hours, relentless and rhythmic, and we sat there in terror, too afraid to move. We piled more furniture against the door and windows, and we kept the fire burning as high as we could, feeding it with broken furniture and scraps of wood. Jake suggested we try to sleep in shifts, someone always awake and watching, but none of us could sleep. Every time the knocking stopped, we would hold our breaths, waiting for it to start again, and when it did, we would flinch. Around 4 in the morning, it stopped. The silence was almost worse than the knocking. We sat there, listening, waiting for it to start again, but it didn't. The only sound was the fire, crackling, and our own breathing, harsh and uneven. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, turning the darkness grey, we grabbed our gear and ran. We didn't bother packing properly, just stuffed things into our bags and fled. We didn't stop until we reached the trailhead, and we drove straight out of the mountains without looking back. None of us talked much on the drive home. What could we say? We had experienced something that had no rational explanation, something that didn't fit into the world we thought we knew. I never found out what was at that cabin. My father just nodded when I told him what happened, like he had been expecting it. He said that some places in the mountains were older than we could understand, and that the things living there didn't want to be disturbed. He said the cabin was built on bad ground, probably over something that should have been left alone. I have never been back to Cove Creek, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm alone, I hear it. 3 slow knocks, deliberate and patient, coming from somewhere just outside my window. And I know that whatever was at that cabin, it remembers me. And maybe, one day, it will come looking.